All right, yes.
Can I ask a quick question? Is bacteria being collected, do you know?
I am not sure. I believe so, but I could probably get a copy of that and what parameters they're testing for, if for anybody that's interested.
All righty, so we're right on schedule. Let's move on to the next item. Knowledge co-production for place-based fishery conservation in Charlotte Harbor, Florida. This is a presentation by Corey Anderson, and we will be, the purpose of this is to share final updates for the Habitat Conservation Subcommittee workshops and the draft project report. Now, this relates to the Fish and Wildlife and Habitat Protection Priority Action Number 2 to protect, restore, and monitor environmental sensitive lands and waterways, including critical habitat areas. And without any further ado, we'll have a presentation by Corey Anderson.
Thank you, Ernesto. I appreciate it. So long title there, but I'll break it down and just say that knowledge co-production is basically just stakeholder incorporated with manager and researcher and expert way to move forward research and management. So that's something CHNEP does all the time, and this TAC does. And then place-based conservation, again, focused in a specific area on a specific topic, something that this TAC has been doing the whole time of its existence. These are just more technical terms from the literature to sort of call these processes that we all work on frequently. So today, this is an update on the Habitat Conservation Subcommittee, or I'll say HCS, draft report. Next, so the project purpose here is to really extend CHNEP's Habitat Restoration Needs Plan, or HRN plan, into place-based topic-focused conservation by leveraging some fisheries research that Charlotte County funded through their Restore program that focused on fish habitats in Cape Hayes within Charlotte County, and using new knowledge to further improvement of management, addressing some CHNEP, CCMP objectives, and really bringing the group of stakeholders and experts and managers and researchers together to identify what our management challenges are, what the uncertainties keeping us from improving management are, planning research together to reduce those uncertainties and hopefully have better management outcomes for conservation of what are sport fish that are an economic driver for the area. So then we want to take that information and apply it directly to management. And our target area is shown there in the map. Next, please. It probably doesn't need to be said that in Charlotte Harbor, sport fishing is incredibly popular. Many people move here for that reason. Many people vacation here for that reason. It's a big economic driver. So it is also a multi-million-dollar industry. This number is for the entire congressional district, so that encompasses a little bit more than Charlotte County, but just within Charlotte Harbor alone, people trying to pursue tarpon is an over $100 million a year industry from a number that's actually quite out of date. So it's probably much more given the costs of recreation these days. And there's our target species in the photos, tarpon up above and then common snook down below. Next, please. So this Hicks project was funded through a grant by the NOAA Restore Science Program. They had their Planning Actionable Science program in 2021, and that purpose was to develop an R&D plan to improve natural resource management, and then that's directly transferred to management for implementation. And as I've said, we're really co-producing solutions. That's everyone together identifying the management issue, identifying the uncertainties and the problems, and then bridging the gaps of how to get there by identifying what research is needed, who can conduct it, and then laying out how to implement it. And there's the award there that we're very thankful from the Restore Science program awarding the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida, who's been the financial manager on the grant, and FWC leading project management and our other partners with the county and CHNEP. Next, please. A little bit deeper into the project's goals, just identifying those challenges to support fish nursery habitats on these two specific areas. Cape Hayes Peninsula, as I'll call it, in the east wall. You could also call it the Eastern Harbor. You could call it the Burnt Store Corridor. It's known by a couple names, but within the report, we've called it the Eastern Wall of the Harbor. Planning that actionable research, which means really digging into what are the things that we don't know and can we feasibly fill those gaps within a reasonable time frame before the next time we need to make a management decision. So we've outlined what the management decisions are, tried to develop decision support tools that can be informed by the research to improve habitat protection, habitat restoration within these critical areas, which are really a rare jewel in the crown of Charlotte Harbor at this point, and becoming rare. And so we seek to do two things: inform the county's 27-28 comprehensive planning update, and potentially codify some habitat conservation policy if approved by the board, and then implement restoration strategies for targeted fish habitat restoration within state management plans, namely within FWC's habitat restoration program, but also within partner programs, for example, water management swim programs and or NOAA restoration center programs. Next, please. And of course, as the granting agency, Restore Science Program has its own goal to leverage funding that came from Deepwater Horizon oil spill into research and support of better management for longer term sustainability of the Gulf ecosystem. So the trick there is making our local program and project goals fit Restore's goal and making sure that everybody is happy and talking and getting multiple things done at once. Next, please. Just another close-up of the study area. You can see the outline of some of the tidal creeks, which are important fish habitat, the upper reaches of which grade into wetlands, estuarine wetlands, and some of these coastal pond habitats, which are one of the major focus sub areas for this. These coastal pond habitats are incredibly productive. They're not all studied, not all well studied, not all quantified as far as fish habitat and productivity. We believe because of some other fishery studies, especially on the east wall, they're incredibly important. And there are management concerns about their sustainability in the future with things like county population growth and sea level rise and water quality impacts. So we'll be delving into ways that we've devised a plan to further improve management of these areas. Next, please. So Hicks project progress has gone through our entire grant work plan at this point. And we're out the other side with the draft plan for committee review. We put together a great team through a competitive process. We were able to onboard Janicki, Wildwood, and ESA as a team to really facilitate a series of workshops, help with the planning and the reporting. And I know Mike is online, so thanks a whole bunch to Mike Wessel for doing the bulk of the heavy lifting and writing, and really getting everyone's diverse perspectives into a plan that I think encompasses a lot of different needs from different stakeholders and great ideas. We walked through a series of workshops, and I'll go into more detail about those, but we really started in November of 21, kicking off, getting everybody up to speed on the science, the data gathering, bringing in additional information, then talking about how that information relates to what policies are out there, trying to feel out what the research needs might be, based on local development policies and what the state restoration policies might be, land acquisition policies. In May, we linked those things together and tried to draft out some tools that could help walk us through if-then scenarios, how we would guide research and then apply that research to our findings. And then our last meeting there in July for the workshop was really to roll out the draft plan, gather some final input on the implementation work plans that are in that report. And so if anyone has comment today, we're looking for that during our discussion. Next, please. Again, first workshop, science workshop, talking about how these remote salt marsh and mangrove ponds act as nurseries. They're incredibly rare because of human development. They've become even rarer than they were historically. And they're very productive and of high value to the tarpon fishery and the snook fishery as well. So healthy, abundant habitat supports healthy fisheries. Without habitat, you don't have fisheries, which is a negative impact on our economy. So we want to make sure that that is resilient into the future. Things rely on more than just existing. They rely on hydrological linkages, habitat connectivity. And so there are some challenges there with stormwater management and development potentially impacting the function of these places. So we identified some data gaps that we have towards better management and seek to fill those. Next, please. This is a wheel of a formal co-production process. So like I said, this is something that CHNEP does all the time, identifying a management topic, bringing in all the relevant parties to kind of get everyone's head around it, identify what the decisions are and the needs are, how we can seek to improve our management of that, implementing a formal or informal research plan. In this case, we have a formal research plan that we've come out with, taking the conservation actions, things that are research-based and non-research-based, implementing them, applying them to our management decisions. Again, county policies for conservation in this case, and also restoration plans, assessing how those decisions have affected our management, whether it's improved or not, and then in an iterative process, if we need to make that decision again, or if it's a decision that comes up every so often, determine if we've done it right or if we need to continue along a trajectory of improvement. So just a big circle of how we're managing this. Next, please. And again, we've tried to fill some data gaps. We've compiled some geographic information. This is pretty small, but I'll just say that we compiled conservation lands, land use, planning and zoning, where our wetlands are, what our parcels are, where our flowways, what the habitat challenges are through wastewater and stormwater impacts, potential for sea level rise. There's other maps that are not shown here that will feed into a future GIS-based decision support tool that we're calling a vulnerability index. That's one of our proposed outcomes. So I'll get to that a little bit later, but next slide, please. Our second workshop was our sort of policy focused workshop. So everything from voluntary acquisition of sensitive lands, alternative conservation measures like rolling easement with sea level rise at top of mind. The county's unique transfer of density program that actually allows movement away from sensitive areas potentially of development density, which can be a win-win for both the environment and developers. We talked about, implementing things like behavioral modification through social marketing, trying to get homeowners associations on board with something like a tarpon-friendly community. Just ideas for implementing conservation that don't take heavy regulation. Next, please. And again, just a list of policy tools, acquisition, transfer of density within the counties, environmental permitting, social marketing, how we can try to address these different things through all the different tools. Started out with listing them and then addressing which ones might be most relevant. We settled on some things like land acquisition where available, sensitive area overlays that could be codified within county plans, and certainly some education for both the general public, the neighborhoods which abut these sensitive areas, and just you know, the staff that review things at the county and at the state, so they can try to minimize impacts or mitigate impacts where they might arise. Next, please. Our third workshop, as I said, linked all those things together. These images here are a summary of what was a collaborative brainstorming Jamboard exercise to look at what the habitat challenges would be, what research needs we might have to fill those gaps and address those challenges through policies or actions, and what the recommendations are that came out of them. So habitat protection, obviously voluntary land protection is big. And then we developed some decision support flow trees in sort of a draft stage at this point to figure out how we would apply those things. We also started to develop a conceptual stressor response intervention model, which I'll show next. I'll just walk you through the top part. So this is broad conceptual model, just identifying the research need, how that science need applies to a science outcome, if it's achievable, and how that outcome relates to habitat protection. So then we take that potential habitat protection, how it might be put into a policy, and how that policy relates to an action. So that's, you know, we ended up with 3 categories of research needs and applications, really in fisheries, in habitat protection, and habitat function research. Next, please. Our fourth and final workshop was really our, you know, kind of draft plan, draft reporting, getting people's feedback on the final idea of it, the layout, how we've conceptually and visually linked the research, the decision to research needs to an application of that feeds back into the decision. And this image just kind of shows how we've leveraged the initial research of where we find these things, these sensitive sport fish habitats, and how they are potentially at risk, what those risks might be, and how we set out going about quantifying the risks and looking at ways to reduce those risks through a series of research work plans. Next, please. And I'm just going to jump right into the research and application plan here, and I'll give you an outline of it. It was included in the TAC packet. For those here in person, there's a paper copy. Thanks to CHNEP for printing that out. Beautiful color copy. But I hope you'll follow along with this. It kind of outlines what's down in the TAC packet. Next, please. So being really specific about our place-based conservation, we have our geographic focus of our 2 areas laid out, and then within that, what the specific natural resource focus is. So what's important is a coastal habitat mosaic of habitats, tidal creeks, wetlands, the ponds within the wetlands, mangroves and salt marshes, and then specifically focusing, excuse me, on the rare ephemerally connected ponds, which other areas around the state do not have a large abundance of say for maybe the Western Everglades. So these are things that have been built up on throughout Florida's history, and really we're lucky in the Charlotte Harbor area to have so many, and to have them been studied a little bit and need further study. They contribute to the recreational fishery and the economic importance of the area, obviously. Next, please. So we addressed the resource management issue. That's how do we make these places sustainable? How do we conserve them? Because they're really a fish production engine. They're like having little natural fish hatcheries. They help us restore the area after red tides, after cold kills, things like that. Our area rebounds after those natural or anthropogenic impacts a lot faster than some other areas around the state relative to the fish populations. And we want to make sure we can keep that into the future. And as I've said, healthy abundant habitat is the way to do that most cost effectively. So in the face of these challenges, we zeroed in on two management decisions. Again, that's conservation, environmentally sensitive lands protection, and potential policy amendments within county comp plans if adopted, and then restoring any degraded habitats or enhancing or creating new habitats where feasible in the future. Next, please. And part of the research plan, as I've mentioned, is identifying those management uncertainties. So we don't have a full grasp of every location, quantification of sport fish use of every pond around the harbor. So we want to get a better idea of that, especially on the eastern side of the harbor, which has been less investigated. Want to try to quantify the effects of various development densities in some target areas that are basically starting to develop now and or will increase in the future. That's particularly over on the Cape Bays Peninsula area. Look at how hydrology changes might affect the function of these areas and what we might do to mitigate any impacts from that. And then try to determine what the range of nursery habitat protections and restoration needs are through assessing different habitat restoration designs, looking at the productivity of areas, fish growth and survival and movement and contribution to the fishery, and comparing some existing habitat restorations to try to pull out what is the best application of different designs to future habitat restoration. Next, please. And so we broke these down into themes to reduce that uncertainty. Again, fisheries studies through direct mapping and getting into the habitats and really assessing growth and movement and recruitment, habitat function and management through the hydrology, some predictive modeling of the hydrology changes and sea level rise impacts, and then what habitat protections and policies might work best. So how do we look at the effectiveness of policies and conceptually tweak them to improve them for the benefit of sportfish habitat, and then look at ways to propose those and package those up for consideration by the board of the county. Next, please. And this is basically just walking through the contents of it. So we start out with the fundamentals, the present state of knowledge, and then a broad overview, executive summary of the research and application plan, what it's meant to do, and what our goals have been. Next. We dive into the research plan with those specific research themes, so quantifying habitat, prioritizing which ones may be most at risk, what direct habitat loss has looked like over time and how that has impacted what we have now, how we're going to assess hydrological impacts, predictive modeling, evaluating the water quality within these areas and how it might change, and then how, again, applying something like the habitat evolution model, HEM model that CHNEP has used to predict how habitat locations might shift over time and or habitat quality might change over time. Next, please. This is our policy plan. It's sort of also how the research is applied to the management decisions. So we first outlined what the current protections are for fish habitat, federal and state habitat protections, local environmentally sensitive land protections, what water quality protections are relevant, and then identified any gaps that apply to these fish because they are not specifically called out by any organization as endangered or at risk or anything like that. So we want to make sure that we can bridge that gap to get these really economically important species that act as also an umbrella for other fish and wildlife species with their habitat to to be a conservation focus. So how we might enhance local conservation policies, how we might investigate different education opportunities for people to do some voluntary conservation to decrease their footprint on the landscape, things like that. Next, please. And then the final chapter is really organizing it all into actions. So taking the management decisions and the science needs and putting those into specific work plans about how we're going to address the themes on a multi-year timeline, and then summarizing those within discrete work plan activities that organizations can tackle. Next, please. Again, those central themes that have come out of this were really research to inform two products. So the first of which was a vulnerability index. This is a GIS-based tool, basically, that incorporates existing and proposed research, fisheries research, characterization of the habitat, water quality, hydrological modeling in places where it's appropriate, thinking about the future evolution of the habitats, and then incorporating that with other existing GIS layers based on zoning and infrastructure, stormwater management, operations, potential future growth, density, land uses, ranking and indexing the most at-risk habitats, and then thinking about how we can apply some kind of land conservation measures. And that would potentially go into a map-based overlay district, which is something that can be codified. And can also come with land protection strategies, conservation strategies, lowering of impact development strategies, and then non-research activities could be potential like NGO land acquisition, or again, this education and social marketing. And that's really the final product that could be packaged as an outcome for informing our decisions. Next, please. And this is a decision support flow chart to talk about what exactly is a vulnerability index. Well, it's something where you incorporate site-specific geographic data, and you look at, for example here, these sensitive habitats. Well, on a habitat by habitat basis, are they at risk or not at risk? And if they're not at risk, we move on and we prioritize our actions in places that are at risk. If they're at a maybe lower level, we prioritize some education, maybe some low impact development, or we try to improve some stormwater management. If it's at a higher risk of degradation, potential for even direct loss with development, we look at trying to work with developers to minimize that. We look at potential county policies to do things like transfer impact development density, development density away from it to minimize impacts. So this outlines how we would apply that specific tool to individual places, and then it's aggregated into a GIS-based tool that will then inform where conservation measures will be most effective. Next, please. And that, as I've said, is sort of a district overlay. So counties can codify district overlays for various activities. They do it to promote development. They do it to designate areas as environmentally sensitive. They do it to try to spur the economy in certain parts of their geography over others. So this is just a completely conceptual example of how a map-based area with sensitive habitats in it would be applied to one subset of our focus area. And that would come with a lot of rigorous data collection and analysis before even being really proposed. So it would have a lot of both scientific and economic backing to make sure that we were, trying to provide tools that could guide county growth in the smartest and most sustainable ways possible. Next, please. Just another diagram coming up here that I wanted to preference, which is really another chart linking the research and policies and decisions together. So this is going to be a really big flow chart. Next. Planning themes, research and action themes. You can see they feed into each other. It's kind of small text on the screen. I apologize for that. Basically, it's our three research and action focus areas that feed into the actual items. Each one of those bubbles is essentially also a work plan. Those research themes feed back into research applications. You can see they kind of condense down there. How they directly feed into our management decisions through a state restoration on the top, and then county policies on the bottom. And then again, there's a constellation of decision options within that. These blue and purple and green highlighted items are all meant to inform the sort of pink ones there towards the end, as far as which of the gold ones would be the best approach. And that's again in the application plan, about 3/4 of the way through, if you have any thoughts about it. Next, please. I'm going to dive into those three areas of the work plan and kind of just give some bulleted titles of what each one is, in case anybody has any questions about what they are. I'll start with the fisheries one next. So those individual work plans really seek to define the sport fish nursery habitat extent. So that's a fisheries survey is proposed to actually go out and look at where fish are using the habitat, where they're occurring within what we think is the entire universe of potential habitats in Charlotte County, and then narrow that down to what is actually being used, and then also start thinking about what might be used by them in the future. That's going to lead into some multi-year studies to perform fisheries investigations that seek to know what is the interannual variability in both sport fish and prey. And that way we can think about how these things vary over space and time. And if we've not captured them in the past, how we might be able to think about them coming online in the future with sea level rise, or which habitats might be sources and sinks for the population. Fisheries movement is sort of a surrogate for contribution to the fishery. So we have technology where we can actually tag and track these fish. Everybody's seen where they tag the great whites and they follow them up and down the East Coast. We can do something sort of similar to look at how the fish within the ponds are growing through a growth study, and then how they're emigrating and contributing to the fishery through some tagging studies. And so those are really going to help us determine what areas are the most productive, and especially what restoration areas are the most productive. We've got a couple in the ground already at Wildflower Preserve and at Coral Creek, and so we can assess which of those designs might be most effective for going forward with future areas. So that's all a bunch of research that's proposed to be mostly led by Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. Next, please. Habitat function and management is a big one, and this is really sort of focusing on some predictive tools. So refining that vulnerability index that I talked about, that's again a geographic information system based tool that we're looking at to characterize and prioritize these estuarine wetlands for conservation, for habitat restoration, based on some of the fisheries and modeling inputs. Assessing impacts through hydrological modeling, that's we're looking at working with University of Florida IFAS, one of their researchers, Dr. Bean, to come up with a hydrology model for a specific neighborhood on Cape Hayes to look at potential future impacts of density and where we might shift stormwater management patterns to minimize impacts. And then also applying an update to habitat evolution model to really refine it for the area. Next. And the last theme is habitat protection and conservation. So this is sort of both research and non-research based activities. So developing that overlay district, from the vulnerability index, really informed by the science to have an end product, and coming up with a transfer and implementation strategy, a handoff of the information, the science, and the tools, the geographic based tools that can then be considered for policy implementation at the county board level, the county staff level, and then the county board level. And then looking at how we might maximize effectiveness of market-driven conservation incentives. So that's like, do we need to tweak or propose tweaks to transfer of development density, or is that something that's already functioning well enough? It may be, it varies with different markets. You know, we have a pretty hot real estate market right now, and it seems to be functioning pretty well, but if that cools off, how might the effectiveness of this policy change? And then developing some targeted conservation social marketing. And that's something that I know CHNEP and also for Sea Grant have been interested in possibly exploring more. Next. So that brings us to sort of the next steps for implementation of this. The report is here today for TAC input. We will basically wrap it up and finalize it from there. A step that's left off here is establishing a water atlas page for this project. So we want to establish an ongoing data repository and page that is accessible and houses all the information and continues to work forward with the research as we go through it, because it's still going to be a co-production process. Then we'll be submitting a proposal to NOAA's Executing Actionable Science funding opportunity. And that date actually, my mistake. So that's August 16th. We're putting in a letter of intent to apply. And then by November 15th, I believe is the final date for the full proposal. And we'll be working with partners, including CHNEP, FWC, Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, which has been a major contributor to the plan, is an excellent partner. Charlotte County, obviously, and then again, the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida as a supporting partner. to really pursue that work plan, to fund some of those items in the work plan in the short term with education and outreach, and sort of that medium term over the next 4 or 5 years, where we can then come out with these data products that inform, say, comp plan revision in 2027, 28-ish, and ongoing FWC habitat restoration projects, and transfer those research findings to inform our decisions. Next. So all of us have our contact information there. I've been the PI on this project. I believe the research project going forward, we may also have Courtney Sari as a research PI involved. And the final slide after this is just open space for tag comments with a pretty picture.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Thank you. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat. So
Yes,
if
Dr.
there's any way
Douglas.
We can open the chat, and we're gonna now open for comments with the board here. If you are interested in make a comment, but let's start with the chat because they'll be popping those.
Mhm.
Um,
Dr. Douglas, if you'd like to unmute and pose your questions directly.
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, and of course got me curious about all the different ways that we could reconcile the development with these ecological functions that we're trying to enhance, like the habitat and water quality functions. So the first question was just sort of, I know the FWC has fisheries independent monitoring programs that monitor fishes in the open waters, and just wondered sort of how you would approach monitoring in some of these backwater places that might be the nursery habitat. And then my second question was if there was any potential for stormwater infrastructure like ponds and canals to sort of do double duty as habitat, or be managed in a way that would increase its role as a sport fish habitat.
Thank you for the comment and your questions. So to address those, yes, FWC has the sort of open water fisheries sampling. They have had a 3-year project that formed the baseline of this to assess some of the nursery habitats on the western part of the harbor. And they've done that by basically hiking into areas with smaller equipment and smaller nets, and being able to set those size proportional nets for the target fish. And so that would also be applied to the future research areas. And basically instead of a 40-meter net, they've got a 9-meter net, and they're able to use a standardized fisheries survey method across all of the habitats to quantify the fish that are in there, both sport fish and their prey community base. And then the second part of your question was about stormwater management, ponds and things doing double duty. Excellent. Yes, we would like to explore that further. Some of the areas where these fish are actually using currently are defunct stormwater ponds and are sort of disused floodplain equalization ponds within developments that have not quite spurred yet. And so we can see that the animals do use these areas, and part of the habitat evolution modeling, I think, is to look at where they might use future infrastructure, or where they might use existing infrastructure in the future, and then how we might cite some restoration areas that could do double duty if needed.
We have another question online from Judy Ott. Judy, would you like to unmute and pose your question?
I'm here. Sorry, I wasn't planning on me. Corey, through this process, is there consideration for how to incorporate rapidly changing conditions? Because one of the things about habitat restoration is that our water temperatures and nutrients and sea level rise are changing a lot faster than they have in the past. And so when we design our long-term restoration, we have to design for a goal in mind that's not as far into the future as we thought. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I mean, again, I think that's part of what the predictive modeling is hoping to address with the habitat evolutions. We've also learned some valuable lessons from our existing habitat restoration projects about how we assumed they might function and then how they're actually functioning based on the ground situation. So the intent is to feed all of that into future habitat restoration plans with some lessons learned and some predictive tools to figure out how we can do it better in the future based on what we know and we think might happen. But you make a good point about the timelines where we assume things are going to happen seem to be accelerating. And so that's a consideration we need to make.
We have another.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. We have another question from a caller, I believe. It says, are there any plans to control over harvesting of young juvenile blue crabs that are being caught and sold for as much as $2 a crab to use as bait for fishing, such as tarpon and other sport fish?
I can't address that question here.
Yeah, this is Kaylee with Division of Marine Fisheries Management. We do have fishery plans in place for things like stone crabs and blue crabs. I'm less familiar with some of the either current or future rulemaking on harvesting like that. I would need to look up a little bit more about those regulations, but I could get back to the caller if they would like to put their information in the email.
Hi, this is Elizabeth. I'm the one who posed that question. I am aware of many people out there harvesting, going up in the shallows in the habitat area for the blue crab and catching those tiny ones. They're like, 1 to 2 inch big and selling them for a lot of money. Oh, and for fishing. And now it's getting even more popular, not just tarpon, but other sport fish. And I am very worried, and I've seen a severe decline in blue crabs in the Charlotte Harbor. I live on the Charlotte Harbor. I live in Mac River. So I was just very concerned about that. Is there any regulations that control those people that catch all those tiny little juveniles? We will not have any more adults if they keep doing that. So it'd be great if somebody can get back to me on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Elizabeth. If you want to put either your email in the chat or my name, my contact information was listed on the website. I'd like to touch base with some of our local law enforcement officers on the water to hear, if they're seeing similar things to you and that there's increased harvest. We do have regulations in place for otherwise unregulated species. It's not just you can take as much as you want. There's usually a bag limit of, a certain amount for unregulated species. So that's something that I can certainly look into and get back with you on, and we can have additional discussions.
All right, thank you.
Indeed.
Yeah, Corey. So there's a lot of growth going on right now in the area, as we all know. And so these tools might take a while to develop. So in the meantime, so we review projects in the aquatic reserves. I know the county's reviewing projects. Is there a contact that we can ask for? Like, hey, we have this project. Is this a vulnerable or sensitive area? And how do we move forward? Would it be like you or Joellen or just everybody?
I think, you're talking about relative to development permit review.
Well,
or just
removal of mangroves on the water and dredge and fill and stuff like that.
Yeah. You can direct those to me for now if you think it's might have a state regulatory nexus, and I can try to address them or direct them to the right office within FWC that does. We do have a land use planning office, but it's not always the most personal to forward it to a standard email address, to get the context. So yeah, I'd be happy to try to direct those.
Yeah, I know FWC comments on permit applications, but are they going to be aware of this project in these sensitive areas? that
Yes.
you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, right. So that's part of internal FWC processes is working across sections and divisions on marine fisheries habitat management in a more holistic manner. So that's, something that we've heard loud calls for, and we're working to address by working across regulations, across habitat preservation and management, and across, more regulatory means to make sure that everybody's talking to each other. So, that's an area of ongoing improvement and coordination.
I'll send you some stuff.
Absolutely.
And sometimes when Fish and Tarpon Trust gets involved kind of on the side of the community, so sometimes we're a liaison or we provide research backing for what we know about nursery habitats. So it's less of like regulatory and more of like helper of the community. We've been involved with a couple of different locations where there have been dredge proposals or development proposals, things like that. We could be on sensitive nursery habitats. That's why we're really pushing for the vulnerability index, so we can kind of line up there's potential development in where there's sensitive nursery habitats. And that way we can kind of inform the commissioners when they're not just based on one side or the other. We can say, look, these will be impacted, but these ones wouldn't, things like that.
Yeah, and your input would be helpful because rather than maybe you're moving all mangroves, your input on maybe we could leave some, have a living shoreline, like having that additional info.
Well, and or unfortunately, some homeowners don't want to hear it, but if there's already a pre-developed location, sometimes it benefits us to continue development or move density units toward them. Obviously, everyone's pushing. If I live here, I don't want more people to live here, right? But if it's already been impacted or it's not impacting nursery habitats, so we want to try to persuade more development in that location and leave the more natural location.
Question.
Any other? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead,
down
Greg.
here. First of all, it is okay to use a full page graphic for the kids' figures. I wish I brought a magnifying glass for my comment. I'm going to look up the right here. Your decision options are based upon this very sophisticated framework that supports their development. And I'm wondering, where's the communication plan to the stakeholders that you have to engage to implement decision options? Especially when you get to the county level, it could be very difficult to communicate the basis of your decision options you want in implementation to policymakers and then to residents and homeowners. And I think that's been given a little bit of a short shrift in this plan. It's even if it's not going to be in this document, it should be some thought on how you're going to communicate this when you start doing it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you do make a good point that it's not specifically called out in the plan. So we do have plans to workshop it with the county board coming up here this winter as we continue to move forward. But having an explicit information transfer plan is a bulleted point, I think, but not completely fleshed out. So I
Right.
think that's a good idea of something that we could flesh out a little bit further so that we make sure that it is more fully implementable.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Corey, I just wanted to have you let everybody know if this is the final opportunity for comments on this draft plan, or if you were still looking for comments, or are we presenting the final?
So I would really like to have people's comments today. If they need to fudge and get them to me by Friday, that's realistic. But yeah, we're trying to put a bow on it, basically.
Okay, I got one question, if I may. How much the public has been participating on this? I'm talking activists, not just, how many of those have you be part of this discussion?
So we've had both some community organizations as well as some professional organizations that sort of represent community groups. BTT obviously represents a large swath of anglers. we've invited various community groups, and we were able to get consistent engagement by Punta Gorda Isles Fishing Club, and also Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast, which sort of represents a, sort of environmentally minded constituency as well.
Well, thank you.
We do have one additional comment and questions. I'm just going to read these off. Mark Schronek says this project has the potential to not only benefit snook and tarpon, but also other recreationally and commercially managed state and federal species and their important nursery habitats. Good work. And then there is another follow-up question from Dr. James Douglas, and he says, Corey, briefly, water control structures like weirs may currently restrict sport fish access to potential nursery habitats. Is there any way those structures could be engineered differently to facilitate access? The fish ladders of the Pacific Northwest come to mind.
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Mark, for that comment. And then Dr. Douglas, yes, you're absolutely right. So we are interested in how stormwater management design and operations will affect fish habitats. We are working with the county and liaising with their, stormwater operations and maintenance group. So this is part of the education plan, is to transfer this to that group as well. These particular species don't necessarily have the biological drive to migrate up fish ladders, but there are potential other options. They do migrate across overland surface areas that are periodically flooded. So there are other designs we could potentially implement. But yeah, it's definitely top of mind about how stormwater management is going to impact habitat function and quality and access. But that said, the way the biology is of these species, they don't necessarily always want to have a solid waterway connection. In fact, the way that the nurseries operate is that they may be periodically disconnected, and that keeps large predators out of the nursery habitat. And then once tropical weather-based flooding returns, they can then emigrate to the fishery population. So they're striking a balance between not enough and too much connectivity, which makes these areas very interesting and a little tricky.
Yeah, just real quick, I just, as somebody who participated in these workshops, I really want to share my appreciation for Mike and Janicki and Wildwood and ESA for putting what I felt was a very complex, nebulous concept into this document. It really, at least for me, it was something that I would venture to say maybe others, it was hard to try and put all of this in a single place and really understand how everything was connected, because I'm not aware of anything to this degree that had been done before that was so intricate. And so I just want to really say thank you to the folks who helped us facilitate those workshops, and everybody's input. And I think your comment on improving the communications plan, how we communicated this to the county and stakeholders was something that we discussed fairly decently in those workshops. And but from my perspective, I think it was important to first get it clear in our heads, and now we're a little bit better equipped to develop a communications plan moving forward, so we can have specific, concise messaging to constituents who aren't as intricately involved in something like this. So I think that's something that we should definitely maintain our focus on. And I think it would be something from either the local level, on part of the state to educate, county folks and have that exchange of information, maybe at a larger statewide level, implementing communications plans or improving on our plans, educating stakeholders about the importance of these nursery habitats, but then also kind of that boots on the ground, people who are in these areas, potentially living on these development sites. So I think it's going to be a multifaceted approach, and maybe something that could be implemented alongside the research that's being done. So I think that's a good point, but something that might be later in the process. Because for me, I really needed to understand this before being able to talk about it. And I think that was something very difficult for me. So having this in a document and seeing the culmination of this is really exciting. And I, think it's just a good example of how something like this can work in action. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. All right, I think we are